What's up, guys? Welcome to this week's episode for Best Bets for UFC Perth, Carlos Ulberg versus Dominic Reyes, where I'll be discussing the most confident picks, the lock of the week, the underdog of the week, and some parlays that I like. Hope you're doing well. Hope you're having a great day. Let's dive into the most confident picks, where we have Carlos Ulberg, Jack Jenkins, and Navajo Stirling. So, starting off with Carlos Ulberg, I think there's a major difference in skill here. There's a big difference in skill here. Carlos Ulberg's coming into this fight on an 8 fight win streak, looking better every time out. He just passed his first real test against Jan Blachowicz, showing composure and discipline by avoiding Jan's trademark Polish power, right? And now he faces Dominic Reyes, who's after three straight knockout losses, he strung together three knockout wins, most recently the clean finish over Nikita Krylov. You know, Reyes did look sharp in that Krylov fight. He stayed patient, he managed distance well, and he didn't rush into any wild exchanges. By keeping his composure, he baited Krylov into overextending and landed a perfectly timed check left hook while moving backwards. It was smart and calculated work. The challenge is that Ulberg is also really patient. He's an intelligent fighter, but with a style that's extremely difficult to solve. Both men will likely approach cautiously, knowing the dangers of rushing in. But Ulberg offers more volume from the outside. He has a variety of strikes, and he's just unpredictable. He mixes in teep kicks, leg kicks, switches stances really well, and he has a steady output that makes him hard to read. He's also more disciplined in his footwork and his distance control. He rarely takes unnecessary risks. Ulberg's defense is another big edge here. He prioritizes protecting himself first, blocking, reading the patterns, and downloading his opponent's movements and habits before gradually taking over the fight. Once he has your timing, he shifts gears and he counters cleanly and controls the pace without abandoning his defensive tools. That makes it hard for opponents to build any momentum on him. Reyes has been finding fast knockouts recently, but Ulberg is comfortable taking fights to the distance. He'll happily chip away from range, win rounds with steady output, and avoid giving Reyes the kind of openings that someone like Krylov was able to hand him. Reyes tends to take risks, which is where Ulberg can capitalize by staying disciplined and landing the cleaner, more impactful shots throughout the fight. And if this fight does reach the scorecards, Ulberg will likely have the crowd behind him, which can sway the judges, even if it does end up being a close contest. Coming off of a strong win to Blachowicz, his resume looks far more convincing than what Reyes has done, right? Whose last high level test, well, I wouldn't call it high level, but his one of his worst losses on his record was to Ryan Spam, which was a brutal loss. It has not aged well at all, right? And in short, I just think Ulberg, his discipline, his variety, and his defensive focus should give him the tools to outclass Reyes in a striking battle that's going to be fought on Ulberg's terms. I just think he's a much more disciplined striker. He knows how to maintain distance better, and his ability to switch stances and fight wherever the fight goes, I think he's going to be able to put up more volume throughout the fight. And while Reyes does have a patient counter left hook that got him the knockout in his last time around, it's live to win here, but I just think he still makes riskier entries versus someone like Carlos Ulberg, who's going to be able to control the tempo at range. He's going to have those leg kicks, those body kicks, and he's going to make the smarter decisions in there throughout the fight. Moving on to our next most confident pick, we got Jack Jenkins. Jack Jenkins, he's coming off of a loss to Gabriel Santos, who's a very talented fighter. But even in that fight, Jenkins had several big moments. He dropped Santos with a nasty head kick early in the first round, I believe. He locked in a deep triangle choke and then smothered him against the fence. It was impressive work against such a physically strong opponent in Santos. Santos's speed on the feet was a difference over the long run, but Jenkins still landed solid shots throughout the fight. Ultimately, it was Santos's relentless grappling that swung the fight into his favor, taking Jenkins down repeatedly, controlling him on the mat, and eventually finishing him with a submission. On the feet though, Jenkins is still dangerous. He throws powerful shots, creative combinations, working high kicks, body shots, and heavy leg kicks. Ramon Tavares, on the other hand, he's mainly a striker who prefers to stand and trade. But in this fight, in his last fight with Davy Grant, he looked pretty basic at times. He looked hesitant as well, and he struggled with the feints of Davy Grant. That's where Jenkins stands out here. He's more dynamic. He mixes in strikes going up and down, head and body. And I think he does that much better than Ramon Tavares does. I wouldn't say either guy is likely to make uh, a run for the title anytime soon. I want to say either guy is elite, but Jenkins looks clearly like the guy who's going to be a step ahead in this matchup. He can chop at Tavares's legs throughout the fight, pressure with power shots, land the better shots, even mix in wrestling if he needs to. He's extremely durable, never been knocked out. Even in the Chipe Mariscal fight where he broke his arm on a takedown, he still looks sharp against a tough opponent in Chepe Mariscal. I expect Jenkins to throw more volume, fight more with confidence, not be so hesitant like Ramon Tavares will, and land the shots that do the real damage. His willingness to mix in the grappling and his durability give him multiple paths to win here. While Tavares is more hesitant, straightforward striking style type of fighter, it's gonna be tough for him to get his boxing going from range against someone like Jenkins. Jenkins has a really nice kicking game. He's durable, and he can wrestle if he needs to, right? So I just think Tavares, he just has such a basic style of boxing. It can be too predictable at times, and he gets hesitant, especially in his last fight. It didn't look good, and it's very unlikely he takes the wrestling route in this matchup, right? So I just think the leg kicks, the body kicks from Jenkins going to add up. The harder shots are going to be landed from Jenkins, and he's going to be able to mix levels and probably win a clear decision in this matchup. Moving on to our next most confident pick, Navajo Stirling. You got to side with Navajo in this matchup. Personally, he's one of my favorite UFC prospects in the UFC right now, right? He's well rounded, he's composed, and he's already shown he can win no matter where the fight goes. In his last outing, he dropped the first round versus Ivan Ursan, but instead of folding, he leaned onto his wrestling. He was able to control the fight and take over late and outwork his opponent in the third round. That fight showed us his determination, his fight IQ, his ability to adjust mid-battle, and he's still undefeated, 2-0 in the UFC right now. I expect him to be 3-0 after this matchup with Bellato. Bellato, on the other hand, he hasn't really quite proven himself against high-level competition. His only notable opponent has been Vitor Petroni, and he knocked him out twice, so Vitor Petroni knocked him out twice. So he's coming off of a no contest right now where he was finished by an illegal upkick, a situation that drew a lot of controversy. But before that, he fought Jimmy Crute to a draw, but he was dropped in the first round and drawn into a sloppy brawl later on into a fight. That's exactly the kind of fight that Stirling won't get baited into. Stirling fights really measured. He keeps his distance, he snipes you from range, and he builds momentum without ever overextending. So the lock of the week, Navajo Stirling. Against Ivan Ursan, Stirling showed why he's so promising. He lost the striking exchanges early, but adapted on the fly. He turned to his wrestling and was able to take over the fight and control the fight throughout after he started using his wrestling. By the third round had come around, he had all the momentum. Then he drops Ursan and he sealed the win pretty much, right? So that kind of adaptability is what was able to win him that fight, and it shows what he's able to use when he needs to. He has the tools to win by any means necessary, whereas Bellato, he's pretty much just looked average everywhere. He's solid, but not outstanding in any one skill. You know, he lacks the composure that Stirling has. And coming from city kickboxing, I feel that Navajo has that it factor. You know, he's sharp, he's mentally tough, he fights smart. I think he can win this matchup in multiple ways. You know, he can keep it on the feet and pick Bellato apart with his striking, or lean on his wrestling if he needs to, you know. I see Sterling maintaining range, peppering Bellato with jabs and kicks, and applying steady pressure throughout the fight and staying composed. You know, Bellato will likely try for takedowns, but I don't see him succeeding consistently, you know? Even when it comes to the striking exchanges, like in the pocket, Sterling's defense and timing, it's going to give him the edge in this matchup, you know? Bellato likes to use his size to kind of bulldoze his way into opponents, where someone like Sterling, he has the skill set and composure to control the fight and may even find the finish as Bellato starts to break down as the fight goes on, you know? So I just think Navajo's composure, his well-roundedness, he's a prospect from city kickboxing. I think he's going to have smart pressure throughout this fight and be able to adjust no matter where the fight tends to go, you know? Where Bellato, he's pretty much just average, you know? He's average everywhere. His takedowns, I see them getting stuffed. And he's going to get hit clean time and time again throughout the fight, you know? Navajo, he's going to be able to control the range, mix levels, and he's going to either get a finish third round or possibly win a decision, you know? Moving on to our underdog of the week. I'm making underdog of the week Colby Thicknesse. Colby Thicknesse. You know, his opponent, Musasa, he was badly exposed in the UFC debut. You know, as a massive, 1,000 favorite, he ate a head kick. You know, he got dropped, then he got submitted. His nickname was the Knockout Wizard, or his nickname is the Knockout Wizard. But most of those knockouts are coming against low level opponents, very low level opponents, and he was massively overhyped going into that fight. Now he's facing Colby Thicknesse, you know, the hometown fighter, a student of Alexander Volkanovski. Thicknesse is coming off of a decision loss to Alexander Topuria, you know, Elliott Topuria's brother, which in itself is impressive, given Topuria's strengths, his composure, his grappling ability. Thicknesse looked locked in the entire fight versus Topuria, you know, showing good footwork, active kicking, and a willingness to fight smart, you know. He wasn't making any careless mistakes throughout the fight at all, you know. And just the style of Topuria, his pressure boxing, his deceptive feints, and his relentless wrestling, it's extremely difficult to deal with. Yet Thicknesse managed to survive all 3 rounds without being finished. And by rounds 2 and 3, he was being ragdolled by the wrestling, but that's against a world-class skill set that Musasa doesn't possess in this fight, you know? Musasa, on the other hand, has shown holes in his striking and grappling defense. In his Contender Series fight, he was taken down 4 times in just the first round. And his striking is decent, but if exchanges gets uncomfortable with Thicknesse, you know, Thicknesse should have no problem mixing in the takedowns and controlling this fight. So on the feet, Musasa may make it competitive, but Thicknesse's durability, his defense, and his well-rounded game, uh, it gives him more paths to victory here, in my opinion. You know, Musasa hasn't beaten anyone notable, and his best win was a split decision on the Contender Series, and there's nothing on his resume to suggest that he's ready for this type of level in the UFC, whereas Colby Thicknesse looked pretty good in his last fight versus Topuria, considering the level of opposition that Topuria is, right? So Thicknesse, he's proven he can stay composed under real pressure, and his durability plus his grappling edge should allow him to dictate the pace of this fight, where he's going to be able to wear Musasa down and win exchanges as the fight progresses. So I just think, you know, being a pupil of Alexander Volkanovski, being so durable, having great kicks for Thicknesse, he has a willingness to wrestle and control the fight. I think it's going to be able to give him an edge here versus Musasa, who has that knockout hype, but against to really low-level competition, he has shaky takedown defense, and he got exposed pretty badly in his UFC debut. So I just think Colby Thicknesse will be able to stay the safer fighter throughout the matchup, and he's going to be able to get top control and most likely win a decision in this matchup. So moving on to the parlay section. So the parlay section, we got the safety lock for the first parlay. I'm making it Navajo Stirling with Jack Jenkins. Stirling, he's still undefeated in the UFC. He fights super smart. He mixes in his striking with his wrestling. He doesn't gas out and shows a high fight IQ. For someone with the experience that he has, I think he's a very safe anchor for the parlays. I'm pairing him up with Jack Jenkins, who's durable, volume heavy striker who mixes in kicks and wrestling when he needs to. And he rarely gets outclassed, and he's proven to be tough throughout his fights. Both fighters are composed, they're well-rounded, and tend to avoid risky mistakes. So I feel like that's why it has to be the safety lock. And they're facing beatable opposition without major stylistic red flags for them. I see them clearly having the edge in their matchups. So -110 for safety lock, I think that's great value, and I'm really confident in this one hitting. Moving on to the ultimate lock, +100, Carlos Ulberg, Alexia Thainara. I do think Alexia Thainara has a huge advantage in her matchup as well. Ulberg, he's disciplined, he's technical, and fights from range with elite distance control. He just beat Jan Blachowicz, and he's on a serious run. I think he gets it done. Thainara, she has strong grappling and can dominate control over time, which pairs nicely with Ulberg striking heavy. I think it's a safe approach as well. You're combining one of the most consistent strikers at the light heavyweight division with a grappling heavy favorite fighter who has a clear path to victory. It's good balance, low variance. And moving on to the affordable juice section at +125, I think this one is really live to hit. Navajo Stirling, Mullarkey, Bedoya over 2.5 at +125. Stirling, the anchor lock here, will stay undefeated. He's steady with a high fight IQ. And the over 2.5 in Mullarkey Bedoya, it makes sense because both fighters have a history of going the distance. They're not reckless brawlers, and this fight is more than likely to be a grind. All of Bedoya's losses come by decision. All of his losses come by decision, and all his UFC fights went to a decision. Half his wins come by decision. The last 3 wins for Mullarkey have been by decision. And when he loses, it's to elite competition. And Bedoya is not elite. So I just feel this is destined to go the decision, right? So you're getting Stirling, high win probability, plus a realistic over. That odds makers might be undervaluing, making this a sharp plus money angle. The over 2.5 in the Mullarkey, it's -170, -175. So pairing that up with Navajo, I feel that is real safe. Moving on to the 3 most confident pick sections, Navajo, Ulberg, and Jenkins. These 3 are the most consistent names on the card, in my opinion. You got undefeated Navajo Stirling. He has got the balanced skill set. Ulberg, elite striking, discipline, and distance management. I think he wins with Jenkins' pressure, volume, and durability. I think it's a really safe 3 most confident picks parlay. All 3 complement each other. You got the grappler striker hybrid, a distance striker, and a pressure striker who can wrestle. They each have a clear stylistic edge in each of their matchups, right? Moving on to the easy workout section, you got Alexia Thainara plus Brando Pericic. I like Brando Pericic a lot in his matchup. Being the hometown guy, I'm pretty sure he's from City Kickboxing as well, and the things that I've seen from him, they're really impressive. Against someone that is new to the scene, like his opponent Elisha is, I think he's going to be able to run through someone like Elisha. You have Thainara with a dominant grappling threat, a strong top control, and a proven path to win against someone like, what's her name? Loma Lookboonmee, who's shown to have vulnerabilities to getting taken down. I think Thainara is going to be able to capitalize on that. And Pericic, he has an aggressive striking style with finishing power, capable of turning the momentum towards his side really quickly in his matchup. and I think he's going to be able to run through his opponent. Both fighters they have very obvious routes to victory, and they don't need a perfect fight to win. Thainara can drag it down, win that way. Pericic, he's going to be able to pressure him on the feet, and it's a complementary parlay with good upside. Moving on to our final parlay, we got Colby Thicknesse, Louie Sutherland at plus 390 for Underdog City. Thicknesse, Underdog of the week. He showed real grit and durability against Toporia's brother. He's versatile and doesn't fold under pressure. Against Musasa, he has the wrestling and pace advantages to win him this fight, And Sutherland, fighting Justin Tafa, one of the greatest UFC fighters of all time. No, I'm just kidding. He's fighting Justin Tafa. He's a live dog with finishing potential and more tools than the odds suggest in this matchup. He can push a high pace and outwork his opponent. I like the stuff that I've seen from him and on the regional scene. So I feel both guys here, they're being overlooked by odds makers. In my opinion, they have a real stylistic chance to win here. At plus 390, you're stacking two live dogs with paths to victory, making it the official swing for the fences parlay, right? But yeah, that does include this card's best bets videos for this week. Remember, bet smart. If you're going to bet, don't chase any losses. Let me know if you found this helpful. We need lock of the week, Navajo Stirling, to come through for us. I definitely think he does come through. Drop your picks in the comments. I want to hear what you're rolling with. I want to know what you thought. But that's it for me. Have a great day. Hope you're doing well. I love you guys. Good luck. I'm out. Peace.